Hello. The Pirates season has concluded, so I figured I would give an update, a little postscript to the terrible season that was the 2020 Pirates season, which can only be described as one that it's fortunate that it was only 60 games long. They finished with a record of 19-41, which was good for worst record in the major leagues. Before the season, you may remember I posted a season preview video where I predicted they would go 26-34. So I was obviously off by 7 games. I figured I just watched that video to see what I predicted, and just wanted to see what was wrong, what was off, and maybe see why those sort of things happen. So let's take a look at what happened. First thing, I questioned who Phillip Evans was, as did most people, because he was one of those guys they had in the offseason and you don't seem to care about. He actually, surprisingly, did pretty well for the Pirates. He hit, let's see, where did I put this? He hit 359 in 11 games for the Pirates. Was actually doing really well. Had a home run, seemed to be this kind of success story, and then he got injured and was out for the rest of the year. So, and that kind of was a omen for the rest of the. Well, actually, by that point, they were already terrible, so it wasn't even an omen. That was just how everything was going in the first 20 games of the season. One of the big things that was different about this year was that the NL had a DH, and I bet that the DH would help in that the Pirates have a crappy bench, and so it would mean so that they wouldn't have to rely on it, which was true, but the problem with that is that if you have crappy starters, it doesn't matter if you don't have to rely on your bench, and the Pirates' hitters as a whole were bad. So that didn't really end up mattering just because there was nothing to build on. Just to give an idea of how bad the Pirates hitters were, they, where was it? Their batting average was 13th in the NL. Their OPS was 15th, so last in the NL. One of the big keys to the reason, and one of the biggest things about why this team was so bad offensively, was Gregory Polanco. As I said in my video, are we going to get good Polanco or bad Polanco? Because throughout his time in Pittsburgh, you've had these stretches where he's been really good and been everything that you expected him to be coming up as a prospect. Then you have these other stretches where he's awful, and you're like, he looks uncoordinated and like he's never seen a baseball before. This year we got the latter. Gregory Polanco hit 153, obviously a career low. He had 7 home runs in 50 games, which is pretty decent. That works out to more than 20 over a full season. But when your OPS is 539, that is unquestionably a terrible year. So Gregory Polanco failing was one of the big reasons why the offense was so terrible. Then you look at, but one of the other big things about why the offense, well, it wasn't why the offense was terrible, why the team was bad, has to do with their pitching. But one of the things that I think is important to note is that, let's see, I didn't write this down beforehand, but I know this offhand. It was a 60-game season, and so that means you had, 3/3 of it that were 20 games each. In the first third, they went 4-16. The middle third, they went 10-10. They were actually decent in the middle 20 games of the year. And then the last 20 games, they went 5-15. Right? Yeah, that adds up. So it's like you had and really in that 5-15 in the end there was a big long losing streak there too. So like they won. I want to say they won 4 of their last 6 games or something like that. But yeah. Anyhow, no, the beginning of the season they were terrible. One of the biggest reasons that happened was so many people all got injured at the exact same time. I believe it was Musgrove got injured and missed some time. Mitch Keller missed a bunch of time. Then you had a bunch of relievers all get terrible, or all miss time at the exact same time. Kyle Crick missed time. Nick Birdie, who is this good reliever that everybody was hoping would be the next big thing. He was out, only pitched in 3 games this year. Keone Kela, who came into Pittsburgh 2 years ago, highly touted, and has just hit roadblock after roadblock after roadblock. He got injured this year, and Keone Kela only pitched in 3 games. Michael Flees only pitched in 3 games. Clay Holmes only pitched in 1 game. I forget if I mentioned Kyle Crick, but Kyle Crick only pitched in 7 games before he got injured. So you have all these people get injured, and it all happened really quickly within the first week or 2 of the season. And so it made it so that by like week 2, every time the Pirates starters, and some of these guys that got injured were starters, if the starting pitchers had a bad night and had to be out after 3 innings, and especially since they're coming off starting a season where they don't have much of a spring training, they're trying to do load management, so they're not trying to, they're trying to stretch them out. They're trying not to have them in the game too long. You have them then giving the ball to the bullpen for 5 or 6 innings a night, and after all these bullpen guys got injured, then you have the 6th or 7th best guy in the bullpen now being the first guy out of the bullpen or something like that. And all of a sudden that meant that you had Miguel Del Pozo pitching multiple times being awful because he was your only option. You had Dovydas Neverauskas, who's been terrible for 3 years now, pitching in 17 games, even though he was bad. They had, let's see, 18 different 23 different relievers pitched this year in 60 games. That's bad. But that just shows, one, guys getting injured, which led to 2 inexperienced bad pitchers who wouldn't normally get as much experience having to be relied on and then crumbling. And so that's why you go 4-16 in the first 20 games of the year, because you're having all these relievers that are crappy being your best option. And so that it just all imploded in on itself. So then, after the first third of the season, you're 4-16, clearly in last place, and clearly your season's going nowhere. And so it changes the whole season very quickly. And so after like the first 20 games, the whole goal of the season is just get through it without anybody getting any more severe injury. But then just compounded. But actually, in the end, by the last 10 or so games of the year, and even like a little bit earlier on than the last third of the season, the bullpen started to get their act together. You had guys like Richard Rodriguez, who had a decent year. He had a 2.70 ERA in 23 innings, 23 and a third innings, FIP of 285, WHIP of 0.857, so that was pretty good. Chris Stratton was decent. Jeff Hartlieb got a lot of action. He was decent. Nick Turley his stats are worse than I would have thought, but Sam Howard is rookie, and he was decent. Nick Tropiano, who they acquired midseason, I think, from the Yankees, he was decent. 1.15 ERA in 7 games for him. So, there were some Austin Davis 5 games, 2.45 ERA. Granted, these are ERAs for bullpen, which isn't a really great metric for measuring a bullpen's or relievers' performance. But overall, the pitching wasn't as bad as you would have thought based on their record. They ended up with the entire pitching staff, starters and relievers, ended up with a 4.68 ERA, which was 9th in the NL. I mean, that's not great, but for having the worst record in baseball, you would think they'd be worse than 9th in the NL in ERA. So the pitching ended up not being terrible. And in starting pitching, once guys came back from injuries, the ones that did, they were all right. Steven Brault probably had the best year of his career. He threw a complete game in I think it was his second to last start, and in his last start he did well too. Mitch Keller, after he was injured and missed about a month and a half, he came back. His last 2 appearances, first was 6 innings with no hits. His last appearance, last start I should say, 5 innings, no hits. He ended the season with 11 no-hit innings. So that's a great, sign of things to come from him. Granted, he had a lot of walks in those games, so that's something that he needs to knock off. But overall, I mean, you can't complain about a guy who finishes the year with a 2.91 ERA. And then Chad Kuhl was Chad Kuhl, 4.27 ERA, which is that's exactly Chad Kuhl. And Musgrove started off kind of bad, but his last start or 2 was all right. But the problem is, if you're looking at pitching numbers especially, are kind of hard to evaluate over a short season like 60 games, because I think Musgrove lowered his ERA by about a run or 2 just by having one really good start at the end. I think he went into his last start with like a 5 ERA and ended up with like a 3.86. So, but the one pitcher that had a really bad year, one starter, was Trevor Williams, 6.18 ERA, 2-8 record. Record doesn't mean anything for a starting pitcher, but his year was terrible, and I've given up on him. I officially, because he had a good 2018. He was never a highly touted prospect. He was a guy they brought over in a trade, I think, for a minor leaguer, I think from the Twins. And then had a really good 2018, and you're like, oh my God, he might actually be decent. And then 2019, he was bad. 2020, he was bad. And actually, did I get the years wrong on that? Because now I'm starting to think it was 2017 he was good. Let's look that up. No, it was 2018. He was good. That's right. Yeah, Trevor Williams 3.11 ERA in 2018, 5.38 ERA in 2019, 6.18 ERA in 2020. So I'm starting to believe that the real Trevor Williams is the Trevor Williams we've seen over the last 2 years. And Trevor Williams right now seems to be, well, it's not as accurate an analogy, I guess, but I was going to compare him to Gregory Polanco, and that this year I think is a year where you can really start to be like, all right, I think it's time to sell on him. And when I say sell, I don't mean try and get valuable trade pieces in return, because when they play that badly, it's hard to get any sort of value in return for them. But yeah, Greg. But that turns me to the offense. Really, I mean, the story of the offense in 2020, if you're looking for a positive one, is Ke'Bryan Hayes, who was a highly touted prospect, coming into this year. He'd been drafted, I think, in 2016, I think. But the thing is, in the minors, he'd never had really great offensive numbers. He was always really highly touted for his defense. I think his OPS in the minors was like 790 or something like that, which is good, but it's not like, doesn't wow you. But this year he was incredible. Granted, he only played 24 games, finished with an OPS of 1.124. I don't even know if that's supposed to be read as 1124 or not. It's so high, you don't normally see that. Batting average of 376, 5 home runs in 24 games. If he can keep up that kind of power, that's 30 home run power. So I don't know if he'll be able to keep that up. But Ke'Bryan Hayes has good defense. We already knew about that. He's got speed, and now if he can also add power and hitting for average, that's fantastic, and that's face of the franchise numbers. But then again, you don't want him to do what another player did this year, which was Brian Reynolds, which has put up great numbers his first year, and you think, oh man, this guy's going to be the next big thing. Brian Reynolds was the opposite of that. Brian Reynolds last year put up great numbers. This year, Brian Reynolds hit 189. Granted, he had 7 home runs, which is pretty good, but 189, 632 OPS, like, that's not going to get it done. And you're really hoping that's just a blip and not, indication of his true ability. I mean, and that's the thing. When you talk about the Pirates offense, the starters that did well are Ke'Bryan Hayes and Colin Moran. Colin Moran had a good year. Power-wise, 10 home runs in 52 games. That's a 30 home run pace over a normal length season. OPS is 797. He started out hitting really well for average and then kind of slipped towards the end of the year, ended up at 247. But, good year for Colin Moran, and that's the sort of numbers that it's not completely surprising out of him. He had that kind of pedigree coming in here, that he might have that sort of potential. He hadn't really developed it yet, but it's not like it came out of nowhere. And really the only other Pirates offensive player that was decent this year, I was going to say, was Jacob Stallings, but looking at his numbers, it's like those are good for a catcher numbers, if anything. He finished at 248. He started out the year hitting really well and then kind of slumped the last 3 weeks or so. Ended up with an OPS of 702, 3 home runs. Not really great. Josh Bell, Josh Bell was terrible the first month or so. Turned it on a little bit towards the end. Ended up with 8 home runs in 57 games. That's about 20 home run over a 162 game season. But hit 226 for 669 OPS. So that's not going to cut it. Adam Frazier hit 230. Cole Tucker, who got injured near the end of the year, hit 220. Kevin Newman hit 224. And then off the bench, you have Jose Osuna hit 205. Granted, he had like 2 home runs in the last 2 games of the year, so that was nice. And then you just had like a whole bunch of bench guys that did nothing. John Ryan Murphy, the backup catcher, nothing, 172. Gerard Dyson and Guillermo Heredia didn't even make it more than like 3 weeks into the season before they were either traded or just let go. Aforementioned Phillip Evans was good, but that was over 11 games. Who knows if that's just a hot week. Eric Gonzalez started out well, but, and then faded. He finished at 227. So the only Pirates starter that hit over 250 was Ke'Bryan Hayes, who didn't even play half a season. That tells you how bad their offense was. So looking into next season, are there reasons for optimism? Not a ton. I mean, as a whole, if MLB does their draft in the way they've done in the past, which is if you have the worst record, you get the first pick, the Pirates would get the first pick in the draft. There's talk that they might not do that because it's such a shortened season. They haven't released officially what they're going to do. But obviously, Pirates fans are hoping they do because that would mean Pirates get the number 1 pick. And the person that is most likely to be the number 1 pick next year is Kumar Rocker, who's a pitcher out of Vanderbilt University here in Nashville. He threw a no-hitter in the NCAA tournament in 2019. Just dominated that tournament as Vanderbilt won the national championship. And then had a good start to the season before the college season was canceled this year. So there's a lot of optimism around him. Obviously, now if they draft him next year, the most optimistic thing is you see like a Garrett Cole type situation with Rocker, wherein they draft him and then 2 years later he's in the majors. So you could maybe see Kumar Rocker in a Pirates uniform in 2023, mid-season 2023. So that's a reason to be optimistic, but doesn't do much for you going into 2021 or 2022. As for those seasons, I mean, the pitching was okay. If Mitch Keller builds on what he did at the end of last year, if Stephen Brault shows that that's the real Stephen Brault, not just a blip, yeah, that's all right. But then you have to figure out what to do with Trevor Williams because he's been awful now for 2 years. And who else do you have? JT Brubaker, who I didn't even mention before. He just kind of had a meh year. He was doing all right before his start in the last game of the season, where he ended up not doing great. And Chad Kuhl was just like a typical 4 or 5 starter. And then Musgrove had, that kind of year where it's like you want Musgrove to succeed, because if Musgrove doesn't succeed, then that makes the Garrett Cole trade look terrible. And just add that to the list. But, and then the bullpen is all right. If guys like Richard Rodriguez, Chris Stratton, and Jeff Hartlieb do what they did this year, and then add that to people like Nick Birdie coming back, Clay Holmes, who hasn't pitched a ton, but there's still hope for him, so, but that's pitching. And then offense next year, like, you can't have your whole starting lineup all hitting 220. You can't have Brian Reynolds hitting 160 or whatever it is. Gregory Polanco, it's like, is there a reason to have Gregory Polanco standing out there in right field next season if he's going to hit 160? So, I don't know. Pirates had a really crappy year, but the good thing is that it's over. This has been Talking About the Pirates with Ed.